started to become evident was that it wasn't the stories themselves that were important. What was really important is what happens when the stories are told. Because when the stories are told and when they're shared, a kind of vibration begins between humans that enables a different kind of conversation and a different kind of relationship. And I became fascinated with that relationship. What happens when stories are told, and how can that influence and help, the work that any of us are trying to do at any one time. So this can be summed up by a phrase of my Maori mentor, Tena Mutara, who explained to me that in Maoridom, we use our differences as resources for one another. The notion that each of us is unique, each of us has different ways of operating and being, but the idea is that those differences are themselves potent and full of potential value and richness, so that if we can understand those differences, and if our differences can be understood by others as we understand their differences, then what we can do is we can create a sort of organic human entity that is far more capable than any of us individually.
Welcome to We Space Rising Podcast, the place for a deep conversation on ways of creating and being together. Our guest today is Theodore Tapliklis, a co-founder of Human Method Lab and a principal researcher at the In Between Us project. Today, he will talk about the method he developed called Entangled Bodies, a powerful learning experience where he invites people to listen to their differences and use them as a generative resource that is far more potent and powerful. Thank you, Teddy, for being able to join me in the interview today. And if you can start with just sharing more about your personal journey and tell me about yourself.
I grew up here in New Zealand, and I traveled with my young family to Europe uh, in order to get a business qualification, because you couldn't do that in New Zealand at the time. I was looking for a business school, um, and in the end, my cousin suggested I should go and look in France at a fairly new business school called INSEAD. And so we went there and just fell in love with the idea of, experiencing a non-Anglo-Saxon environment and going to this international business school. But what was happening, I was always trying to figure out, how do we make teams and groups and projects that really function properly. So I tried to keep up with all of the latest thinking in all of the latest management thinking, and to implement that wherever I could. So I got involved with Peter Sengi's work in the learning organization, and a number of others. But what was happening is that I was very slowly but continuously sort of falling out of love with business, because it seemed only to touch part of what interested me and part of what was important. In my last corporate role, I was at the top of a large mutual life insurance company called AMP, and in the course of this role, I commissioned this very extensive research project that invited people to sit down and talk about their lives to us. And our purpose was to try and figure out for 150-year-old organization, as we were, who were those folk out there that we were seeking to serve and be relevant to, and what was happening for them? How could we match their needs and desires and so on? So this turned into a life-changing experience for me, because the invitation to talk about their lives sort of struck people. To begin with, they were a little bit hesitant, but once they understood that this was for real and we were genuinely interested, these stories came pouring out, and people sat with us for 3 and 4 hours, just discussing the pathways that their lives had followed. And I listened to all of these stories and found myself profoundly affected. It turned out that although every life was different, there were some very striking things in common. And the thing that sat with me most of all was an enormous sense of isolation that people experienced. Everyone described situations in which they felt they had to decide things for themselves. And at each major turning point, they seemed helpless to know what to do, even though they sought advice from professionals. All of that seemed unsatisfactory. The picture that emerged for me was because this was a random sample of the population, and eventually we talked to hundreds and hundreds of people, this pattern really, really struck me powerfully, that people felt separated from one another, felt trapped in their own life stories. Typically, they had a sense that there were alternatives, but those alternatives seemed too difficult or too daunting to really contemplate taking on. And so the overwhelming sense was, this is my life, I had better get on with it. This kind of deep resignation, not sort of pathological suicide or anything like that, but just a kind of deep grinding resignation and acceptance. This really got to me in a big way. Listening to so many people and seeing this pattern repeated in so many different ways was like a calling to me. I felt it's impossible not to respond. And it was clear that whatever I did in the business world, that wasn't going to be enough to address this very deep-seated and sort of pervasive sense of loss and disappointment. So that was the turning point for me. I left the world of business and set off on a journey to try to figure out how to respond to this calling, without any real idea of what the response would be. I just couldn't turn away from it. And so that was the start of what's been now a 27-year long journey to where things have got to today. It began with a big focus on story and storytelling. I'd been moved by listening to stories, and I could see that a lot came out of an environment in which people felt free to talk about themselves. And I thought of applying this, in organizational life. So began work that involved listening to people's professional stories of how they, of their work and how they got to where they were. And in that work of gathering stories, this was now, I'm talking about the very early 2000s, and the notion of what was called knowledge management and storytelling in those years was very fashionable. In the first phase of this exploration of mine, I gathered colleagues and we undertook projects to capture the stories of people in working life, and to develop navigable archives of stories so that you could. And we did some exciting things from a technology point of view around being able to manipulate audio files and relate them to text, to theme them, and so on. And yeah, we invented a kind of a mobile phone app before there were mobile phones as part of this work. As this work progressed, and as I started to write, I had an invitation to write something for an academic publication, and I did that as sort of as an experiment, and that excited me to start looking for other people who were writing in topics that were related to the work that I was doing. That really began another stage of my life, because what that meant was that I was linking the work I was doing with inquiries that were going in other parts of the world but were related. And as that progressed, as those relationships deepened, I was finding the emphasis of my inquiry shifting from stories to conversation, to the nature of exchanges between people. That earlier idea in knowledge management that somehow we could store knowledge in stories and retrieve it started to fade away, because what started to become evident was that it wasn't the stories themselves that were important. What was really important is what happens when the stories are told. Because when the stories are told and when they're shared, a kind of vibration begins between humans that enables a different kind of conversation and a different kind of relationship. And I became fascinated with that relationship. What happens when stories are told, and how can that influence and help, the work that any of us are trying to do at any one time. Ever since I'd left the world of business, I'd found myself slipping into different worlds, for example, into the world of nursing was a very big move. I did research and learned about nursing. Later on, the world of social work. Still later on, the world of family therapy. Then I made my way back into the world of business and spent time in relationships with large corporations like BP. But now I was doing it with this different perspective, always around conversation. So I began learning about Te Ao Maori, the world of Maori, and this was my first real confrontation with a culture whose roots went back before there was writing. And so I began learning about practices that were oral practices rather than written practices, and their history and their rituals and so on. I started to visit marae, that's Maori villages, and learn how things worked in those environments, and that was enormously exciting. But at the drama school, they had developed a way of teaching which brought the whole school together into one studio at a time for several hours. And they had learned a way of teaching that engaged, 150 or 200 students and staff in a single activity, something I'd never seen before. And the way this worked was that there were teams of teachers, teachers who worked as an organic whole, so that as one teacher was making an offer to the students, another teacher was reading the room to see how that offer was being received, and then influencing the way the offer was presented in order to make it fit better. This business of working to the needs in the room was also being taught to the students. So the students were doing the same thing. When the students interacted with their fellow students, they were not only conducting some inquiry or performance or piece of work, but they were at the same time evaluating how that work was happening and how successful it was. So, one person would have his eye on the back of the room and another person would have his eye on the front of the room. And this work that involved a kind of immediate presentation and then this kind of meta examination and analysis just fascinated me. And I could see how powerful it could be if we could figure out how to apply it in our own everyday world. And that work, that recognition of not just what to do, but what to do about what to do, had its roots in Maori understandings. That's how it had evolved. And that led me even further into the world of Maori, and I was able to spend time in workshops on marae where we were learning the art of encounter. That is, the actual details of what happens when a group of visitors arrives on the at the village or on the marae, and what happens between the visitors and the people of the place, the tangata whenua. And it turned out that in Maori, there's a very elaborate series of steps that are involved in reaching, in order to reach a place where people can truly connect and converse and have productive conversation. But unlike in the West, where we just go into a room and bang, somebody says, this is the agenda, this is what we have to do. In Maoridom, there are a whole series of careful steps of preparation before you get to that place, so that when the conversation begins, people are attuned to one another, are ready. And that seemed to me to be a lesson that somehow we needed to introduce in our own world. But it was also clear we couldn't do it by just copying what Maori did. We needed to find our own pathway, something that that reflected our own background and our own history. And briefly, that is the background to the history of Entangled Bodies and the work that you and I have started to do together.
Can you tell the audience what is Entangled Body?
Yes, Entangled Bodies is a kind of culmination of this journey. It's an attempt to formulate a practice, a way of being together and of working that engenders the kinds of positive working relationships that I think we all enjoy when they happen. It's a way of trying to get into flow within a group of people, where each person feels, on the one hand, comfortable and open, but on the other hand, they feel that what is special about themselves is understood and acknowledged and is made use of by others, as they in turn recognize what's distinctive about others in the room and try to play to those strengths as well. So this can be summed up by a phrase of my Maori mentor, Teina Mutara, who explained to me that in Maoridom, we use our differences as resources for one another. The notion that each of us is unique, each of us has different ways of operating and being, but the idea is that those differences are themselves potent and full of potential value and richness, so that if we can understand those differences, and if our differences can be understood by others as we understand their differences, then we can, what we can do is we can create a sort of organic human entity that is far more capable than any of us individually. And I think that capacity to operate in groups, in tribes, in gatherings, in all kinds of human association is absolutely fundamental to being a human being in this world. But it's something we have largely neglected in the Western world for something like 400 years. Since the time of Newton and Descartes, who made this kind of paradoxical move in which on the one hand was about escaping from the scholastics and the idea that all knowledge had to be received. No one could formulate their own knowledge. That had been the dominant worldview in the Middle Ages, that there was a special tribe of people who spoke Latin and they held the keys to everything. And so Descartes, in particular, led us away from that, but in doing so, created the idea of the self-determining individual. I think, therefore I am. The idea that the I is now the important part of being human. In many ways, that's led to the discoveries of the universe and of science and of so many wonderful things about the world today, but it has also completely crushed former, especially pre-literate ways of being that allowed people to see themselves not as isolated individuals, but always as part of a continuing cycle of working together. And so that's why anthropology is very interesting, because anthropology can surface and the study, not just anthropology, but the study of humans in prehistory, or of human beings who, still have oral traditions and pre-literate traditions. They can show us examples, living examples of how this natural form of organic collaboration is able to work. And Entangled Bodies is an effort to try to bring that instinct, those instincts, back into play, without leaving behind, of course, all of the discoveries of the human world in the last 400 or 500 years, but reminding us of what is actually possible. And I guess the secret, the key to this is the understanding of attentiveness. How can we pay attention to one another and learn from that paying attention? The examples that I'd seen at the drama school were really good ones. This deliberate focus on not just what was the work, but how was the work being performed and how was it being understood. So all of those things have come together in the formulation of Entangled Bodies. So Entangled Bodies is a practice which invites people to become more attentive. We conduct exercises in which we play kinds of games in which people learn different kinds of attentiveness. They begin to sense the richness of what's going on in every moment that often just passes us by. And then to use that to build a picture of how we can bring our differences together, and use those skills of attentiveness to become powerful, organic working groups in whatever we're doing, as families, as groups of people at work, as people in public life, or simply as people meeting on the street, as strangers. All of those circumstances are susceptible to this very simple learning that we're trying to invite people to take part in. So, it's kind of a very ambitious project, but it has a real sense of simplicity, I think, at its heart. It's not an intellectual exercise that we're trying to create here. We're simply trying to open ourselves up to all of the faculties that we already have, and then to use them in a purposeful way.
I mean, I really want to also chime in on, because I'm experiencing entangled body practice. But before we're going there, I know you've been kind of experimenting with a different approach, pivoting with the entangled body practice. What is the key element in the entangled body practice that you think make the shift? In people who are in it?
Well, I think, there are a number of things. I wouldn't like to overlook the importance of how the work begins, the beginning practice. That is the work of gathering a group of people and making an invitation which brings everyone into the room in a way that they feel comfortable with, and then settling them, helping people to feel settled and present. And the work you've done with mindfulness relates to that aspect of the work. So there's kind of there's a preparatory step. There's a way of helping people to get ready, and there are quite a lot of different techniques for doing that. And I don't think we've invented anything that's special there. We're just paying attention to the importance of that. But once we're together and once we're ready, what we try to do is to give people a task where no one has any special privilege. It's a task that is open to everyone in exactly the same way. So we kind of start off with this level playing field. And with that level playing field, we allow each person to kind of recognize what's distinctive about the way they conduct their approach to the task. The key to the work is slowing down. And in order to slow down, and this notion of slowing down is now recognized in lots of practices, but we have a particular technique that we've found really helpful, which is to record people's voices in these shared tasks so that we can listen again to one another. Now, I mentioned the level playing field. The level playing field that we start with is by listening to a conversation that doesn't belong to anyone in the group, but is about someone else. We listen to a recording of others talking, and then from the experience of listening, we record each person's response, and then study those responses to notice the differences and to notice the quality and the character of those responses. And it's not just enough to listen, but it's also work to listen again. We've discovered that repeated listening of short pieces of conversation reveals layers of detail and meaning that otherwise pass us by. And so our practice involves inviting people to listen again and then to talk about what they hear at each listening. And it's extraordinary because we are all human beings, but we're all different members of the same species, then we hear different things. And as we hear those different things, we can point them out to one another. And in pointing out those differences to one another, we can open up our own ability to hear. So once I notice, Christine, that you pay attention in this particular way, that tunes my senses, and I can say, okay, there's something I hadn't noticed, but now Christine points it out to me and I listen for myself, I can hear it too. Something that I'd never paid attention to before. And in that act, there's also this fascinating piece of kind of self-navigation that goes on, because as I notice what you notice, that helps me to understand what I notice. It reflects back on itself. So in other words, in the same moment of experience, Christine is listening to this thing, but I'm listening to this other thing. And that means that Christine and I sit in this relationship, this different relationship of listening. So each of us, so in other words, we position or navigate ourselves through this act of listening. And we work in Entangled Bodies. We like to work with groups of 5 people. And in 5 people, there's a lot of difference and a lot of different noticings going on. So therefore, there's a huge amount of learning. This goes right back to, the original work that I spoke to you about, this original storytelling work, because what happened for me in my listening to other people telling the stories of their lives, and then later on people telling the stories of their work, is I came through this practice of listening, because I was not just recording it. I was not just listening for the first time, but I was recording it and then listening again in order to make sense of it. So I was exposed to people's utterances, over several times, and in that work of listening, I came to appreciate what incredible richness and depth there is in the human spirit. I came to love people in a way that I hadn't before. And I wanted to share that sense of wonder and love. And in a way that was one of the most powerful motivations for all of this work. I thought there's this amazingness in every person if we only take the time to pay attention. And it goes beyond, particular experience or opinion or, culture. It goes to the heart of what it is to be alive. And if we can share that, we can, and then start to use that. Wow, what we're capable of as creatures, living creatures on the earth.
What is we space for you? What is significance about creating collective coherence? Because I think that's part of the practice that you're doing as well.
I was thinking that, in my working life, I came to see that in I'm talking about my kind of commercial working life, our typical way of seeing one another in an instrumental world is in instrumental terms. So if we think about the CV, for example, that classic document that in which we try to describe ourselves and fit ourselves for employment, that entirely focuses on what we do, what we have done, and what we can do. So we see one another in terms of doing. Christine can do this or has done this. She has this skill or this capability or this experience. First the narrative work, and then the conversational work, and finally Entangled Bodies opens up, is the possibility of seeing one another not for what we can do, but for who we are, our being, our sense of being in the world. And that opens up a different basis for connection. A good example of this is that this attentiveness allows us to glimpse what one another are reaching for, what their aspiration is, what they want to happen or would like to happen in the world. And the reason that's useful is because when I understand your aspiration, when I sense what you're reaching for, I can connect that with what I'm reaching for, an aspect of what I'm reaching for. If Christine is going for that, then I'm doing this other thing that might be useful to Christine, and Christine's aspiration be useful to me at the same time. So instead of connecting on the basis of, for example, our physical attributes, or how tall we are, how loud we are, whatever, or the stories we tell about ourselves, our histories, our work histories, and so on. We can form relationships that are now focused entirely on where we're going, on where we're heading. So it's about collaboration, not on the basis of what we've done, but on where we're going, where we're traveling, the road we're on. And that's, I think, potentially a very powerful basis for working together. And that sense of where we're going is often hard to put into words. So it may not be in the actual words that people say, but it is nonetheless there. It is behind the words. It informs the words. It's in as much in the hesitations and uncertainties and pauses and struggles to find words as it is in the actual articulation. And that's why that kind of listening is helpful. We talk about aha moments sometimes, don't we? And I think an aha moment is like what you're talking about when you talk about the body. It's a bodily response, not an intellectual response. It's like the hairs go back up on your neck, and you realize. So connecting through these aha moments or through the body is a way of forming entirely different and powerful kinds of connections. And they kind of mingle colleagueship and friendship and common experience. For example, our physical attributes, or how tall we are, how loud we are, whatever, or the stories we tell about ourselves, our histories, our work histories, and so on. We can form relationships that are now focused entirely on where we're going. So it's about collaboration, not on the basis of what we've done, but on where we're going, where we're traveling, the road we're on. And that's, I think, potentially a very powerful basis for working together. And that sense of where we're going is often hard to put into words. So it may not be in the actual words that people say, but it is nonetheless there. It is behind the words. It informs the words. It's in as much in the hesitations and uncertainties and pauses and struggles to find words as it is in the actual articulation. And that's why that kind of listening is helpful. We talk about aha moments sometimes, don't we? I think an aha moment is like what you're talking about when you talk about the body. It's a bodily response, not an intellectual response. It's like the hairs go back up on your neck and you realize, so connecting through these aha moments or through the body is a way of forming entirely different and powerful kinds of connections. They kind of mingle colleagueship and friendship and common experience in and they jumble them up in kind of new ways so that you probably can't see the joints nearly so easily. Over the weeks and months that I've come to know you, Christine, I feel it's your Christineness that I really relate to now. It's not in anything you particularly say or particularly do. It's just that clear, bright, shining star of your being that I feel and want more of. And that feels like a great basis for doing stuff together.
Thank you. I love what you say about Christineness, and the same thing. Like the way I feel connected with you, it's about Teddiness, and the people that are involved in the entangled body practice. It just I grew this sense of respect and an awe of their unique perspective, because their unique perspective enrich my unique perspective, and that invite me to work together with some people there, because it seems when we talk in that presence, we kind of creating something that is bigger than if we just do it by ourselves.
There's perhaps one other aspect of entangled bodies we should touch on before we finish, which is this comes back to the lessons of Maoridom in the work of Encounter, for example. And then I've seen the same lessons in the First Nations or Aboriginal people of Australia through the work of Tyson Yunkaporta, which is the idea that there are patterns, working patterns, which come together to form a sort of complete set of powerful capabilities, that all of which add up to something purposeful and useful and so on. And that's something we've tried to capture in the idea of the 5 graces. The 5 graces is a way of seeing 5 different kinds of work that are done in productive human groups. So we talked about our different forms of attentiveness, but if we step back from ourselves as individuals and think about the patterns of collaboration, right, we can spot that there are specific kinds of work which are really useful for somebody to do. And if we can arrange things between us in the way that we operate, we can make sure that all of those things get done. Now, maybe we don't have time today to talk about all of those things, but they are all different aspects of productive human activity. The idea that there's a way of noticing those, and therefore of noticing when they're not happening, I think is potentially very powerful. When we realize that despite our best efforts, there's an important kind of work that no one is doing in this particular moment, that's a very helpful insight, because then that allows somebody to step forward and to take responsibility for that form of work. So in a way, I'm just touching on that, and perhaps we can talk more about it on another occasion.
Yeah, we should talk about it for another occasion, because I'm very interested in I know you're still working on it. I'm really interested in the dynamic of those works and how um, it seems the work is not so much about the doing, but where it comes from, um, and how it's connected. So it seems like more being connected with the doing. The being itself, it's the part of the doing.
So yes, so there's an important step here. When I come to see, when I come to understand more about your perspective and where your orientation is and where your responses are coming from, so that's like the first part of this noticing work, then I can also recognize, from this perspective, Christine is doing this particular kind of work. That orientation accomplishes this particular set of needs, or fills these needs. And so that's where we turn the mindfulness and presence practice into something truly practical and everyday, so that we can spot how a group of people makes the best sense of things together. I think mindfulness is a really helpful and useful initiative, but it's still concerned essentially with people as individuals. And so it's that move from individual orientation to this, using our resources for one another, this collective thing. That's the crucial step, I think.
So we're almost at the end of our hour, Teddy. I have a question for you. So what is your learning age now regarding your work and the journey in an entangled body?
Interesting question. I think the puzzle I'm trying to unravel, our tools are language, and in our present world, writing is a very important, and so we communicate ideas and intentions by describing them in writing. And so, we've come to pay a lot of attention to the ability to articulate and to communicate with skill. I think in some ways the internet has helped us to add a lot of visual sense to our written material, because we can use we can introduce movement and flow and so on in ways that we couldn't easily with written documents. But I'm still sure that there's a way of communicating that goes beyond any of those things. One of the learning edges for me is, how do we move from communicating in order to persuade towards communicating in order to invite experience. So I don't want to persuade people to do this work that we're engaged in. I want them to, in a sense, persuade themselves by finding it and doing it and finding out what it is. That's a learning edge for me.
I'm just soaking it with your questions because I think it's a very important uh, questions, because the way we learn in marketing, in the way sales work and everything else is about how to persuade and convince others.
Mm.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that's the frustration that I found in the world of business, and maybe you're touching on too. That persuasion is such a kind of narrow band form of communication. It works by eliminating a whole lot of things from.
And also I felt is more about I understand you so I can do something or get something, which it's kind of disaster for connection.
Yes, yes, yes,
But it's
yes.
different because then I want to understand you because I know you have something that can enrich. It's more like I'm understanding you not to close you down or to narrow you down, but I want to understand you and hold the space together. So
Mm,
it's a very different, even like the feeling in the body is very different too. There's more openness about it. There's
that's right.
more ease, like it's more, there's an
Yeah.
easiness in there too.
Yes, just coming back to finally to a theme that we touched on before, discovering people in the way that I've been privileged to through this, listening experience, means that you come to recognize others uh, uh, way beyond existing labels and ways of, you know, describing people and thinking of them. And this is where you you discover the wonder of, of the ordinary, that that um, and also that some of the most powerful connection and communication comes from situations where people are inarticulate, are unable to use words, but but it's their struggle that that brings things to life. um, in a sense, that's when someone is struggling with something, that's a fantastic way of recognizing your own struggle.
That's so
Anyway,
true. Yeah, that's so true.
yeah.
Yeah, I learned a lot about silence too, like through Entangled Body, how in the silence there's so much data. So it's not stopping. So goes beyond words and what they said, but that even in that silence, there's another kind of communic response
Yes.
in there as well.
Well, thank you very much for this. This has been a lovely
Thank you.
experience, Christine.
Thank you, Teddy. It's beautiful what you're saying. And another thing, there's a last questions I want to ask you.
Sure.
So where people can find you if they want to connect with you and learn about about Entangled Body?
Okay. Well, there's a website which, like most websites, is never quite up to date, but it's called between-us.net. And that's the kind of repository for the explanation of the research and the development work that we're doing. Um, we're behind time in adding details of all the people who are involved with this work, including you, Christine. But and so that's to be done. That's one form of connection. Um, I'm part of a community called Enspiral, Enspiral, and um, I can be connected. I can be found through Inspiral. You can Google Inspiral and find me and my colleagues there. Yeah, I can be contacted by email by anybody. Just my surname, Taptiklis, Taptiklis @gmail.com. That's probably all we need at the moment.
All right.
And I try to keep up with anyone who contacts me. So, cards and letters are fine.
Thank you, Teddy, for your time, and I appreciate you to be here right now, and hope to connect with you soon.